go. All right. Well, I'll put my camera on for a moment. Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm in my car. Do not mind the car. It will not be a distraction for the discussion. Well, I'm really happy that you all were able to join us for our first book club for You Want to Talk About Race. So this is actually a book that was recommended from a good friend of mine. And I think it is one of those conversations that's quite awkward to have, right? It doesn't matter if you're white, it doesn't matter if you're Black. It's really difficult to speak about race. And I think, because all of you have read the book, you'll understand where I'm coming from. It really just is because we don't speak about it enough. So I'm really excited to get all of your thoughts on, what you've experienced in regards to these conversations, and then how having this book as a tool has either assisted you, motivated you, or helped you to continue having these conversations, especially with everything going on in the world right now. So I would really love to start off. I've highlighted a few pages throughout the chapters, the 3 chapters, which I think set up this conversation about discussing race beautifully. Obviously, in chapter 1, we have, is it really about race? Chapter 2, what is racism? And chapter 3, what if I talk about race wrong? Which, I don't know about you, were the 3 things that came to mind for me. It's like, okay, so how do we define this thing? How do we talk about this thing? And holy moly, what if I mess this up? So if anyone would love to start by just maybe pointing out in chapter 1, one of the things that really resonated with you the most, I would really, really love that. And if you even want to read a portion of the book to, to provide everyone with a little bit of what am I looking for? Clarity in what it is we're discussing, that would be great. Let's see. I can even start. What was that?
Oh, you're good, Lauren.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Oh, you know what? I think honestly the first 2 pages for me were a big point that just put into perspective and allowed me to realize that we have people in our lives that we believe might have the same views as us. And until we start having these conversations, we realize there are differences. The differences are not a bad thing. But I think what's important and what's pointed out here is, I'm trying to find specifically the right part. Man, I thought I did a better job at taking down notes, y'all. Oh, here we go. Page 9, the paragraph that starts with Shirley. So Shirley, if you improve things for the lower class, you improve things for minorities. He adds, seeing the disappointment and weariness in my face. But I'm going to go ahead and engage in this conversation, because if I can just make some progress with one well-meaning white dude about why class will never be interchangeable with race, I'll feel a little better about our social justice movements. What's interesting about this for me is that when they were first having this discussion about how race and class are interchangeable or not interchangeable, I was really perplexed and confused, very honestly. I was like, wait, what are we talking about here? I don't really even understand what your point is. And it wasn't until reading this that I realized, oh snap, yeah, they will never be interchangeable. They're completely different, right? Anyone have any thoughts about this? Were you did you have the same reaction? Were you, yeah, Moni?
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of reminded me of this weird Facebook interaction I had with my next door neighbor growing up a few years ago. Actually, it was right after Philando Castile had been killed, and I posted something, and then he started responding, and he's like a middle-aged white guy, middle class, and he started comparing a lot of what was very specifically affecting the Black community, and comparing it to himself because of the 2008 recession, where he was like, well, I was affected by that. And so I don't really understand where you say that it's like very specific to, and it was kind of like, and then, and it goes on in the next couple pages too, where it's like, saying something that is about race doesn't mean that it's only about race and that it only affects this group, but it's like, yes, for, a lot of what we talk about affects a lot of different groups, but at the same time, we can't really separate it from race. Like, it's not just about race, but that affects the conversation so much. Like, your perspective is not going to be the same because you have all these privileges.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't,
Yeah. And the other thing about that was cool too, at least for me, was like, just because, let me back up. The conversation in regards to this book is really talking about how racism is affected by the system in its entirety, in its whole, right? And how experiences of Black people, experiences of white people, one or the other is not more important than one or the other, but that's simply the conversation we're having right now is in regards to the issues that surround this. So being supportive and being respectful of those experiences, but also acknowledging that just because you've encountered an experience, just because you've encountered a hardship, we also have to consider and take into consideration that race, with those difficulties and those hardships, does make this a very different situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I thought was, again, when she put that into words, I was just like, man, that's so true. I never thought about it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I also like in that same page when she says, she asked the question back, why do you think Black people are poor? Do you think it's for the same reasons that white people are? I thought that was really keyed into, it really made me think about that more. And even further on, one thing that really struck me too is that a lot of times when I've had dialogues with other white people, they want to explain it away. They're looking for a very black and white, for the purpose of a bad pun, black and white answers. They're not looking, there's not an engagement where you want to like look at it deeper. They just want a very black and white answer. And she gave an example of like, and I just want to read it to you. Hold on. Basically, it was when she was like, you're walking down the street and you're constantly like getting punched in the arm. And then someone wants to point out that specific time where you got punched in the arm, and they can explain that away, not realizing you're constantly getting punched in the arm. I thought that was a really good analogy too for the experience of a Black person.
No, it absolutely is. And I think it's important because it also puts into context, there are some folks who become outraged when they have interactions and they don't understand why someone is upset or hurt or just tired. And we really have to put into context and understanding that just because you had that one interaction with that person doesn't mean that they haven't experienced this 5 times in the same day or in their lifetime, which is a lot, So it puts into perspective for sure. The thing that I thought was really great was her breakdown of discussing her basic rules, how she went into, it is about race if a person of color thinks it's about race, and the way she breaks that down. So I just want to read one paragraph. So something can be about race. That's just on page 16, the very first paragraph. Something can be about race, and that doesn't mean that it is only about race. So exactly what Moni was saying earlier. When I talk about being followed in a store by a white clerk, it is about race because regardless of the clerk's intention, I'm bringing with me my entire history of a Black woman who's routinely followed around by staff or security when I shop in stores. This clerk herself may not be thinking of my race at all when she's following me. So this really just leans into the fact that her intentions may be good, but her involvement in that scenario as a white woman does affect how that situation is perceived by the other person involved, right? The second point she makes is it is about race if it's disproportionately or differently affects people of color, which for me was like, oh my gosh, this is such a great point that I feel that we overlook so often. So she says racial oppression is a broad and cumulative force. This is on page 17, paragraph 2. It is not a system that puts all its eggs in one basket. And racial oppression will interact with many other privileges and disadvantages to produce a myriad of effects. So yes, you can have a Black athlete who won the genetic lottery and combine it with a superhuman amount of dedication and then sprinkle him with a lot of luck, and he will turn into a professional superstar, earning tens and millions of dollars. She says this to point out that people will often make statements to say, well, Black people aren't oppressed because you have Beyonce. Black people aren't oppressed because you have Black people who are athletes or billionaires. And it's like, yes, but when we look at the full picture, not one specific event or one specific person, and we have a trend or a pattern, we have to take that into consideration about how it affects that entire race or population, right? And then her third point, which for me, I was like, man, I didn't even consider this. It is about race if it fits into a broader pattern, again, kind of piggybacking on that second point, that disproportionately or differently affect people of color. And that's so true and so important. So many instances and times we hear people make statements such as, oh, well, like that stuff happens sometime. Or like, oh, it was just one time. And it's like, no, but you're considering this one event and really in this moment making the decision to not acknowledge how it affects the whole picture. That's a Did that resonate with anyone else as well?
Yeah, I just want to bring up one point for sure. Real quickly, that also it's also one of those things that kind of strikes a chord with me. Obviously, I'm not a person of color, but it kind of strikes a chord with me when people use the argument, well, I have friends that are this, that, and the other. And I'm like, okay, just because it doesn't bother that friend of yours to say a certain thing or to do a certain thing, or like they're cool with you, doesn't mean that your actions don't affect this group as a whole. And I think that that's a lot of the mark that gets missed, and people just don't understand these points that are getting made as well. But that was just something I wanted to bring up.
No, I think it's a solid point, and it brings that whole entire section home. Did anyone else have comments on that?
Yeah, I just think that this really sets the tone for where the upcoming chapters go, where we separate. She starts to break down the concept of the individual versus the whole group in a lot of really thoughtful ways. Whereas like white people get kind of judged by, if something positive happens for a white person, it's earned, it's legitimized. If something happens, positive happens for a Black person, it's, they endured, like they fought, they're one of the lucky ones or whatever. Like there's all sorts of coded language around it. But, if something bad happens as a white person, they're a bad egg, they're an outsider. Say you're a white person that decides to, I don't know, storm the US Capitol. Like those are some outsiders. Those are like fringe. Those are weird. They don't represent white people in general. Those are just some bad ones. But it's like, if, people feel comfortable generalizing and painting with very broad strokes about Blackness in general, and then not allowing for individualization.
Yeah, this is a really great point. This is where in the book she discussed how systemic racism. This is a system. This is when she defines what racism is. There's two definitions she provides and gives us. It's in chapter 2, page 26. She says the most common definitions of racism in my own summation are as follows. Number 1, racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race. Or 2, racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race when those views are reinforced by systems of power. So in that example he just gave, that's really her. That's when she really expresses and explains to us that it's not that people are suppressing a person individually. It's that they're suppressing a person individually, and a system that's in place that affects that entire race is also oppressing this particular group of people, which to me, again, it's like, yeah, it's so true. And it's so clear as day that that is absolutely what's occurring and happening. Yeah, that was her first chapter was a really great lead into discussing this major problem.
Yeah, that's something I've found when I've been having conversations with a lot of most of my most heated conversations have been with people that I went to high school with, because I grew up in a very white suburb, and you know, like over the summer I had a friend or a former friend, who, you know, was talking so much shit about the protesters, and you know, he was like, well, I've been arrested before and I am not scared of cops and da 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 da. And I'm like, okay, cool. That's individual. And the fact that you have been arrested before and you have had that interaction with cops before and you're still not scared of them is very telling of your privilege, because you never had to be scared of them. And like the suburb that we grew up in, like we were not policed, you know, all of the time. Like we had park districts, we had people investing in our schools, and he was just like couldn't wrap his head around this bigger picture, because he was like, well, I personally had these few experiences. And it's like, yeah, that's valid, but
No, that's a really great point. So the next thing from what Moni's, this is actually leading into it beautifully, is what's the purpose of this? Like, what is the purpose of this book? How do we utilize this as a tool? And that was on page 29, really discussing this idea of accepting what we can control, accepting what we have control over, rather.
Right.
Is where she says, getting my neighbor to love people of color. This is on 29. Getting my neighbor to love people of color might make it easier to hang around him, but it won't do anything to combat police brutality, racial income inequality, food deserts, or the prison industrial complex, which again, all systemic, right? Further, this approach puts the onus on me, the person being discriminated against, to prove my humanity and worthiness of equality to those who think I'm less than. But so much of what we think and feel about people of other races is dictated by our system and not our hearts. So it's really, at this point for me in the book, it's like, okay, am I reading this because I want to convince the person who doesn't believe racism is real, that racism isn't real? Or am I reading this because I want to figure out what systems are in place that are causing the oppression, right? So figuring out for me really at this point what one I can control, but also what the real issue or the real problem is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Any comments here?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of a kind of a good parallel to that, and given that we're kind of in the bar world to some degree as well, is like, it's good to not use straws, because then you as an individual are not causing harm by putting out more garbage plastic out there. But the real goal would be for the manufacturers to stop making plastic straws, just as an example. And so it's like, yeah, it's good to not walk down the street yelling slurs, but you know, what would be really helpful is to like take a step back and look at the actual systems that we're all working within that are enforcing and reinforcing again and again in kind of a background noise way, the actual systems that are, you know, that are perpetuating racism.
For sure. And to also pick our battles wisely. So maybe I do have a neighbor that it would be so convenient for me to have more pleasant interactions with them. So having a conversation with race about them is cool and dandy, but also what if nothing comes of that? I'm not going to waste my energy to execute that if ultimately it really isn't going to do anything. And that's the cold-hearted truth, you know?
It's not cold-hearted. You got to protect yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other comments in this section? I'm trying to look at my notes. 32. So page 32 starts discussing institutional support in a way that I thought was rather great. So furthermore, it's the first paragraph on page 32. Furthermore, ignoring the factor of institutional support of racial bias as a component of racism means that we erase the real harm done by that institutional support. When we say all racial prejudice is equally harmful, we are denying a large portion of the harm done to people of color and cutting ourselves off from opportunities to repair that harm. But when we acknowledge racism as a part of a system, instead of being limited to our ability to win over racists, we can instead focus on how our actions interact with systemic racism. No, the problem isn't just that a white person may think Black people are lazy and that hurts people's feelings. It's that the belief that Black people are lazy reinforces and is reinforced by a general dialogue that believes the same and uses that belief to justify not hiring Black people for jobs, denying Black people housing, and discriminating against Black people in schools. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting, yeah, the way that she broke that down.
Yeah, I like that she broke it down of like, here's the individual harm, and then here's the larger picture of that and what it actually does. Like, yeah, we don't want to hurt anyone's feelings and we don't want to make anyone feel terrible, but it's so much more than just that.
For sure. And humanizes it a bit. I mean, the thing that I like about this book is she's not speaking down to anyone, Black or white. It's just like, hey, here are the facts. This is how it is. It's a very approachable read. It is uncomfortable and it really allows you to think about what part you play in the conversation, but she's respectful throughout all the points that she makes in regards to the topic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. The next thing. Ooh, page 33. So how to begin the discussion. So this is the paragraph that says, while all of the above may make sense as you are reading it now, I understand that it does little to help in conversations where people are entrenched in their definition of racism that does not consider systems of power, which is damaging, as we just discussed, right? So how do you move forward in discussion of race when accusations of reverse racism and racism against whites start flying? First off, understand that this is almost always a defensive reaction to feelings of fear, guilt, or confusion. This is an attempt either to move conversation to a place where the person you are talking to is more comfortable, or to end their conversation completely. For me, this paragraph made me seriously look within myself what I do when these things happen. And I think what's important about that is and she goes on to discuss this, but like, ensure that we're educated in the topic. I never have a conversation about something I am not well informed in. One, because unless I'm just listening and not engaging, what's the point? What do I have to provide to the conversation? And two, the other thing, quite frankly, is I do have a tendency of getting defensive when I feel that I'm being attacked, but most often I do allow folks to get everything they want to say out, and I'm very respectful. So again, looking within myself, I was like, damn, do I do that? Damn, like, shit, I should approach this so differently, you know? That was that really like stuck with me. So then she goes on to say, consider restating your intention in engaging in this conversation and ask the person you're talking to confirm what they're talking about, which is great. One of the best lessons I ever learned is if you're having a conversation with somebody, ask them a question, right? Ask them a question, allow them the opportunity to expand on the idea, one, for your clarity, but two, to ensure that that this individual who is involved in a conversation with you actually knows what they're talking about, right? And this is not like to be like threatening or like, you know, to be disrespectful, but truly to ensure that you're both getting the most out of the conversation. So she says, I am talking about issues of systemic racism, which is measurably impacting the health, wealth, and safety of millions of people of color. What are you talking about right now? Which is great. Often if somebody is just trying to use reverse racism arguments to shut you down, this is where they will repeat themselves or claim that you're a hypocrite. So you'll know at that point whether this person actually wants to have a conversation or they just want to hear their own voice, which, okay, I mean, like, I guess whatever you're willing to engage in at that point is really your choice. But if somebody does want to have a productive conversation and genuinely believes that being called, and I this section for me was like, gosh, this is so crazy. Being called a cracker, or, you know, using the N-word, feels angry and invalidated by the insistence that both do not meet your definition of racism, they will say so. So this is an educational opportunity. This is a great way to let that person know that you do hear them and that your experiences do not erase theirs, because even though their experience is valid, it is a very different experience, which is so important. Be respectful and acknowledge that we all have our own experiences, right? And ensure that when we're having these conversations and guiding these conversations, that we're also staying in alignment with what the conversation is about, which is important. Because often, and she goes on to explain this, we want to incorporate our own personal experiences. If I'm having a conversation with someone about how their family was affected by, the Holocaust, I'm not going to go and say, oh yeah, well, you know, slavery was a thing. Like, that's not what we're talking about in that instance. That is completely not the right thing to do. That is completely insensitive. And although there is fact in that statement, it's not what we're talking about. So that it's just not a valid statement to make in that instance, right? So yeah, that was a great chapter for me in defining what racism is, and then it also really allowing us that start of how to have those conversations about it, right?
I really
Yeah.
like to further on in that paragraph where she says, you know, being called, and she was using, you know, a cracker as an example, may be humiliating, but those feelings fade. And, you know, what's the measurable impact it's going to have on your life? You know, on your ability to walk the street safely, on your ability to get a job? How often has the word cracker been used to deny you services? What measurable impact has that word had on the lives of white Americans in general? So I think it's really important to also be able to put that into that context.
Absolutely. I think that's a very solid point. Again, goes back, and now every time I talk about this, the first thing I do is think of the definition of racism. I'm like, okay, yes, it's talking about systems and how they affect this, right? And I just keep reverting back to that definition. Such a great point. Anything else in this chapter that, you know, resonated with people that you want to bring up?
So to add to that part, this part in particular for me was super helpful in like having conversations with like my mom in particular, because it's a weird, I'm in a weird space of like, I'm a like non-Black person of color. And so and like immigrants and the Arab community, which I'm part of, has had really weird, and awful interactions with racism, especially in a post 9/11 world. And I feel like a lot of different, POC groups, when we speak very specifically to things that affect like the Black experience, a lot of us want to be like, well, we also experience racism in this, and this way. And I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily like understand why that is changing, that like whataboutism is harmful. And that was something that I noticed that when I was trying to have these conversations with my mother, she would do, and she would like bring up her experience of racial discrimination. And then it was always so weird for me to be able to segue that I'd just be like, let's focus. But this book really gave me that tool of like, okay, so like my approach was just different. It's like, yes,
Yeah.
mother, absolutely. We also experience all of these things, but that's not what we're talking about right now. And that's a conversation that should happen. But this is a different conversation. It's two different conversations.
Yeah.
And then it helped kind of like, it helped turn all of our conversations into not fights. And then it just, it kind of like clicked a little bit more.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And her explanation of how we need to tie racism back to its systemic causes and effects when we're explaining why something is wrong was so great, because how often do we see something on social media? Social media is so toxic in that way. I mean, we have the ability to share things and comment, right? But like we'll see something, we'll see somebody post something and it's like, this is wrong, this is messed up, period. And it's like, yes, but we also have to explain why, because in many ways, and I hope it doesn't sound awful to say, it's like validating it while also educating. And it's important with anything. I mean, the first thing we learned in elementary school is cause and effect, right? So I think it's really important in regards to this conversation that we're doing that. And she explains that for anyone watching later on page 35 really nicely. All right, chapter 3, my favorite chapter personally for what we're discussing today. What if I talk about race wrong? What was everyone's thoughts here with the way she kind of like started off this chapter?
Oh,
Stacy, did you want to?
Is that when she, I'm not at my house and I left my book at my house. So is that where she starts off with, you're going to get it wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, she talks about her mom and how she had that awkward phone.
I loved that actually, because I thought it was so interesting because, you know, when you're reading the perspective and you're like, oh, right. Like you don't think like, oh, her mom's white and her mom doesn't see her that way.
I know.
And so to me, I thought it was like a super interesting insight and a great way to start the conversation because, you know, her mom sees her one way and not necessarily recognizing, you know, what she's had to deal with. And it's, you know, and she's someone who gave birth to her. It wasn't even like she adopted. It wasn't like an adoption situation. It was like, this is my daughter. And like, she didn't, for 34, it's crazy to me that it took 34 years for that conversation to happen.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think the thing that was even more interesting for me was that there was a learning experience for her and a great one, and she was receptive to it, right? Like it was such a beautiful thing. I think also the fact that her daughter was, and obviously she does this for a living, Ijeoma, right? But she was like, no, you are not going to say that tomorrow to this man. We are not going to do this. This is why this is wrong. And that is her daughter. And she felt that she owned the Black experience because she had Black children, right? Half Black children. So I thought the way she explained it was beautiful. I thought that entire chapter was just so moving. Yeah. Any particular parts anyone want to read or share?
I thought it kind of highlighted too, you know, the generational gaps too, because at the time, like she was probably seeing that mother as super progressive and
Absolutely.
you know, and colorblind, you know, and I think it helps kind of look at, you know, some of the generational differences and how we, you know, progress as human beings and what it means to be progressive. And I think it shines it highlights, you know, we still have work to do, you know, even with this mom that, you know, had a Black daughter, you know, can miss the mark.
I totally agree with that. Also, not that it was relevant, but up until this point, I didn't know that was her story, right? Which doesn't discredit her work by any means, but I do think the point I'm trying to make here is that she says this part really like, it was like gut wrenching for me. She says, her mom says, well, why don't you identify as white? On page 42. Yeah. And she said, I explained that while I had definitely inherited light skin privilege due to my mixed heritage, I did not feel that whiteness was something that any person with brown skin and kinky hair could inherit, because race doesn't care what your parents look like. Just look at the light-skinned slaves sold away from their Black mothers by their white fathers. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't even think about that. Like, that is insane. It's crazy. Nobody cares about who your parents are. Nobody cares about who your other family members are. They don't. They really do judge you based on your appearance, unfortunately, right? In regards to what we're discussing, obviously.
Right. Well, because when she walks into a room, people aren't like, oh, I bet her mom's white. So
Yeah.
she's gotta
Exactly.
be this way. Like she walks in and you see just the color of her skin. You don't see her lineage.
Exactly. You see black. That's what you see.
Mhm.
And I think that she's just such a great writer. I'm just like head over heels, but I do think that this was such a pertinent part in explaining that even if you think you're going to talk about race the wrong way, with her situation, her mother, right?
Mm.
And she says, I'd much rather talk about her sex life. Like that you have to lean into it, and you might get it wrong, and that's okay. But
Yeah.
now her mom is advocating for this conversation amongst her white friends, and really providing them with tools and the opportunity to be involved and be a part of the discussion in a way that really just aligns with who they are, right? So it's just so powerful. It makes me want to have this conversation with my mom, and she brings this up. There's a part, and I can't remember what chapter it is, but generationally, right, there are biases that exist. Well, my mom is old school Black. She's in her 70s, and and I would say she's not a racist by any means. She sometimes says things that make me question what her thought process is, but I also understand that that's ingrained in her because of the way that she was raised and what she experienced. But that doesn't make it right? Yeah. So I think that that's a really great way to lean into these discussions. Like, hey, mom, when you say this, and again, she's so much more woke now. I have like 5 younger sisters, and she's been through a lot. Like, one of them is gay, and like the way that she's handled these situations from when I was younger to now being older is beautiful. Like, the changes are just beautiful. But I think, being comfortable enough to say, hey, mom, this is not okay to say, and this is why, right? And not being afraid to have those discussions, even with people like our parents. I think it's important. And then I think in this chapter, the last thing I wanted to bring up was her explanation of, you're gonna screw this up, it's totally fine, here are some tips. Does anyone just want to read like the bold numbers and how she goes through them? It starts on page 45.
Sure, I can start. Do you want me to start the bullet points, or just start from the beginning? You're going to screw this up.
You can read the 2 paragraphs. You're going to screw this up, and then we can go through the bullet points.
You're going to screw this up. You're going to screw this up royally more than once. I'm sorry. I wish I could say that reading this book would guarantee that you'd never leave a conversation about race feeling like you've gotten it all wrong and made everything worse, but I can't. It's going to happen. It's going to happen, and you should have these conversations anyway. So now that I've thoroughly bummed you out, let's work on what we can do to lessen the number of times you screw this conversation up, minimize the amount of damage you do, and maximize the benefit to all involved. Here are some basic tips that will increase your chance of conversation success, or at least decrease your chance of conversation disaster.
Yeah. So who wants to read the first one? You don't have to read the entire thing. You can honestly just read the first thing, and then if any part of that resonates with you or relates to you, feel free to tell us.
I don't have my book, or I would.
No worries. Well, the first one is state your intentions. Is there any part of that for you that like, oh yeah, that's a good point, that's a bad point?
Honestly, like all of those bullet points were super helpful in like it's one of those things that you just want to have like on a notebook, like when you're about to engage in those conversations, like, okay, do I have the right information? Why am I doing this? Because and so it helped me feel like I'm not crazy. Like, how do I handle and maneuver and go through this?
No, for sure. And I think you hit the nail on the head. At least for me, again, I'm truly like a believer that like if someone can say something in their wordsmith, and they can make it a tangible thought, it's like a beautiful thing. So her layout of like, state your intentions, remember what your top priority in the conversation is, and don't let your emotions override that. Do your research. Don't make your anti-racism argument oppressive against other groups, which is so important. So important. We can touch on that in a second, because I just saw someone do this the other day. And I was like, no, I get your intentions are right, but you can't do that. When you start to feel defensive, stop and ask yourself why, which is also important. Do not tone police. If you're white, watch how many times you say, I am me. Ask yourself, am I trying to be right, or am I trying to do better? Because you know that sometimes we can just get in our heads about that type of stuff. And then the last thing she has here is, do not force people of color into discussions of race. So yeah, I think you're right that all these points were like, man, this is great. Don't let emotions overtake and overtoll the conversation, which is important, especially with a topic that's so heavy. And it yeah. And then I think the last part of this was, it's important to learn how to fail, to learn how to be wrong in a way that minimizes pain to you and others, and maximizes what you can learn from the experience. So lean into that humility. I make mistakes all the time. I'll be the first to say, when the black square thing happened, I shared it. And then I completely own the fact that I shared it and I messed up. But from that experience, what I was able to do was ensure that not only do I understand the message, but that I understand the mission to the message. And that even though something sounds good, that I'm doing my own research, right? With everything in regards to something that's as important as this, especially being in a position where there are so many people who reshare my stuff in regards to this topic. I need to make sure that I am doing my own research and my own work, and not just believing the first thing that I see. So her advice for tips when conversations on race have gone very wrong are the following. Stop trying to jump back in when a conversation is beyond saving. It seems like you're all rational beings, so I'm not really worried about that being a problem. Apologize. Don't write your synopsis of this conversation as the time you got yelled at. I'm guilty. I've definitely done that before, and I need to be better about that. Don't insist that people give you credit for your good intentions. That just sounds awful. And then don't beat yourself up, as well as remember that it is worth the risk and commitment to try again, which is the most important part. Keep trying. We're all working and learning together, and anyone who tells you differently is not human. I'd like to meet them, introduce them to me.
I really think that's why this book is so successful, and why it can be so concise, is because she just like nails it in so few words, makes you have those realizations, and then follows it up with like bucket loads of empathy. Like all these bullet points are all like, first, make sure when you're going to have these complicated conversations, know that they're complicated. It's probably not going to go perfectly, but just like, we're talking about harm reduction. Like you're trying to improve things. So like, just keep your eye on the prize and take it easy. It's great.
Yeah, like I wish I had this book way sooner than I actually did, because I like reading this particular chapter too. I like thought back on like so many times when I was like really first starting to learn about anti-racism and starting to try and implement it into my life. And then like, when you first learn about something, you're like so excited and you're like, oh my God, I just want to like talk about it all the time. And just like, let me share these things I learned, and looking back on that, I'm like, oh man, I made a bunch of mistakes. And like, I still do make a bunch of mistakes, but like having this framework to be like the guide is really, really nice. Cause it's like helps keep the thoughts concise.
Sure. And then just like I kind of like what Stacey was saying earlier, I kind of like just want to have a bunch of Post-its on my windshield. So as I'm driving, if I get in a conversation with someone like, rule number 2, but just like having those reference points. And I'm probably going to end up rereading this a million times. But I hate how she makes this very approachable she acknowledges that we're human and we're not going to get it right, which is the most important thing. And she's encouraging. It's not discouraging. We want to keep turning the is important.
Lauren, you mentioned, and this is something I'm probably not aware of, but you mentioned, you posted like the black square, but I wasn't even aware that there was like a controversy around.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. It was intended to be for the music industry, and I honestly, when I shared it, I originally thought it was like, we stand in solidarity, share this black square. That's the only thing that will be on social media. And by actually sharing it, I was taking away from the message that was attempting to be achieved. So I realized that later on. And I immediately put a story up like, hey, this is what happened. I didn't basically everything I just said to y'all. Just, I vow moving forward to ensure that I know a lot more about the things that I share. Even if the intention is good, it can be harmful, because that was I shouldn't say very minimal. I don't mean to say it. That was minor amongst many other things that could have obviously happened. But when several thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people did the same thing I did, obviously it has a huge impact, a negative one in that regard, right?
Gotcha.
So yeah. Cool. I have one question for you all before we conclude. So I want to know what feelings this book evoked in all of you, or I guess for the first few chapters. I know some of you have read it in its entirety, but just curious, whether it was how you felt beforehand, how you felt while reading it, how you feel now that you've read the entire.
For me, personally, when I first started reading this book, I had no idea let me backtrack. I knew what I was getting into just with the title. I knew what I was looking to educate myself. I was looking to do the work. But I didn't realize the impact I did not realize the impact it was going to have. I knew it was going to make some sort of change, but I did not realize the amount of things that I do day to day that could just be so damaging to what I really want to convey. And this book really kind of brought a lot of things to light for me personally, that I want to definitely work on, not only within myself, but just in a community setting as well. And I honestly, just in the first, I was hooked in the first chapter, and it was so powerful. And I've gone back and I've reread the book. I've had it for a little less than a year, but I've gone back and reread it a couple of times. And it's like every time, Lauren, I know I said this to you earlier, every time I go back and reread the book, I find more little treasures from it, and it's like something else sticks out. So I definitely think that for me, it's something that I recommend to people who are asking the same questions that I did at one point, like, how do I get better? What do I do? It's like, okay, well, here are some options. Pick something that fits for you. And people have asked me, can I have your copy of this book, that book, whatever? It's like, no, those are mine. You should spend that money on that person who spent that time and energy, and pay that money to that person. And you can't have mine, because I like to go back and reread. But why don't you spend that money, donate to that person who poured their heart and soul on a subject that they had no business dedicating to you, but they're giving to you, and support them, and start reading and start learning and start changing your own behaviors, and start figuring out what works for you and what is not working for you, if you're really looking to make that change and if you're really wanting to be open about this. But that was just something that I felt reading this book in the several times I've read it in the last year.
This was actually the first book I read that wasn't a cocktail in years. And what a great way to break away from that cycle. Yeah, I've actually ordered her other book like immediately, right before we got on this call. I was like, okay, I see where.
Mediocre. Have you started reading that?
No, I just ordered it.
I have it on audiobook, and I'll because I do drive long distances a lot. So I usually just like get books on audio and I'll keep them and like reread them and whatnot. This book I have in book form, but I have Mediocre on audiobook, and I laugh a lot. It's not meant to be funny, but it's like you kind of just like end up laughing a lot when you like it's a great read. It's a really great read. It's not meant to be funny, but it does make me laugh when I think about like certain situations that I've been in with other people and thinking about those times of being like, "Oh my God. Oh my God." Like it's funny to me because one, it wasn't me that did it, but it's just like looking back on those things and it's true. But yeah, I definitely recommend Mediocre. I haven't finished it, but I've definitely gotten through the first several chapters, so it's good.
Okay. All right. Well, I feel that my purchase is a good one then.
I'm really excited to read that one. I just ordered that and Amber Ruffin's new book that she wrote with her sister Lacey. So waiting on those two, but they
Yeah.
yeah.
Any points in the first 3 chapters that resonate with either of you?
I don't know. I guess I keep going back to her tone. Like, we talked, like she mentioned tone policing. And I think when you're talking about something like what this entire book is about, and it's written by a Black woman, like I would completely understand if she is absolutely furious with every sentence or, swinging emotionally wildly to and fro, because this is her life. Racism is the air we all breathe. White supremacy is all around us. Like it's just a constant struggle. And I like that she writes it in a way that almost every paragraph starts with like it's like a heavy sigh, and then like, what's it going to take for me to get through to you? But she again puts it in such an empathetic way that it feels like even just through 3 chapters, and I'm a little bit past that we all feel more prepared to talk to our version of her mother. You know what I mean? Where you have someone who you would personally defend as like, they're a good person, their heart's in the right place. They, like you were just saying about your mom, may use the wrong terms or outdated terminology or not realizing the kind of like harm that they might do just by kind of voicing things in a certain way. But like the amount of empathy and undeserved patience that she gives to the reader is just, it's so good, and it's so helpful in getting this through to people. And later she goes into a little bit deeper waters, but I just think that it sets the tone so nicely.
Yeah, and it's good for people. I think it's good for people that are like both a couple years into this journey of unpacking the racist system in which we've been socialized in, but it's also really good for people that are just starting to like, I was a few years in of like unpacking all of the harmful things that I grew up with, and it gave me just like a brand new structure to be able to think about everything that I had been learning differently. But it's all like, I also have talked to people who haven't really read anything, and this is like one of the first pieces of like writing that they've read on these topics, and it's things that really resonated with them as well. So I like that it is applicable for a lot of different time periods of where you're at.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think I've always kind of considered myself to be progressive, but as I was going through the book, I'm like, yep, I've done that. Shit, I've done that. So I think, it's, and I think it's just a journey, that we're going to go through, and a new, more levels of self-awareness. And yeah, I'm really excited, and look forward to the next chapters, because, a lot of scenarios kind of come to mind. What about, when in this kind of situation, and I'm looking forward to kind of talking about those in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Stacy, do you have anything, or Miriam?
No, I mean, I'm just like really glad to be part of the conversation and having this forum to be able to feel safe to make mistakes and not be judged, honestly.
Yeah.
'Cause it is a journey. And like, I grew up in New York. I'm from Queens, and my
Oh,
high
from the
school.
Bronx.
Oh, to see, so my high school, like, I, like white people were like a minority in my
Yeah.
high school. So for me, like, I just had to like I always felt like I wasn't particularly. I never considered myself racist because it was just I was so in that world. But you see, there's things that you just don't recognize or see as
Yeah.
a white person. But I'm glad that I'm, you know, always on. I feel like it's one of those things that you're going to be constantly learning. It's
Yeah.
a constant journey.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you being here. And, just to give you perspective about my background, I grew up in the most Italian neighborhood in the Bronx, and I was one of the only few Black families. And honestly, when I grew up, I didn't see a lot of this stuff at all. I was like, oh, they're all so nice to me, or, whatever it may be. Or it was just, it was very much something I could like glaze over or ignore because it wasn't directly affecting me as a child, right? So it's been a really great journey and a learning experience for me as well. So I completely understand that. Marian, anything you'd like to share? No? Okay. Well, I thank you all very much for being here. Truly. I think, let me see, for next week, do we want to do chapters 4 to 6?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we might honestly be in a position where we have like 3 or 4 more chapters. If everyone is gonna consistently come, we can do an extra week. I would love to finish the entire book together.
Cool.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, this
Thanks
has
for
been
doing
fun.
this.
Awesome. All right, I'll see y'all soon. Thank you.
Okay. Bye. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Stay warm.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.